Alright, stop scrolling for just 1 second because I need to ask you something. Do you actually think you know Family Guy Season 1? Because I thought I did. I grew up watching it, rewatched it probably a dozen times over the years, and I genuinely believed I had a solid handle on where it came from, how it was made, and what those early episodes were really about. Then I went deep. I mean really deep into the history of this show. And what I found completely changed the way I look at those first episodes. There are facts buried in the origin of Family Guy Season 1 that most fans, even the obsessive ones, have absolutely no idea about. And once you hear them, you will never watch those early episodes the same way again. So if you have ever spent even 5 minutes with Peter Griffin and the gang, you need to stick with me through this entire video. Because I promise you, by the end, and your understanding of one of television's most culturally significant animated shows is going to be fundamentally different. Let's get into it. Let's start at the very beginning, because the story of how Family Guy actually came to exist is genuinely one of the most unlikely origin stories in television history. The show was created by Seth MacFarlane, and by the time it premiered, he was just 24 years old. 24. Think about that for a moment. When most people are still figuring out their careers, still deciding what city they even want to live in, Seth MacFarlane was launching what would eventually become one of the most recognizable animated franchises in the history of American television. But the path that got him there is where things start getting really interesting. MacFarlane had been developing his style at Rhode Island School of Design, and during his time there, he created short animated films that would lay the actual groundwork for Family Guy. One of these was called The Life of Larry, and another was called Larry and Steve. These shorts featured a bumbling, not particularly bright middle-aged man and his more intellectually capable dog companion. Sound familiar? Because that dynamic, that exact relationship between a lovable but dim man and a smart dog, became the foundational blueprint for Peter and Brian Griffin. The Griffins essentially evolved directly from these student film characters, which means the roots of Family Guy go all the way back to college art projects. That alone is remarkable. MacFarlane sent these shorts to Hanna-Barbera, actually got hired there after graduation, and the rest of that story started building toward what we now know as Season 1. But here is something that tends to get glossed over when people talk about the show's history. Family Guy did not premiere to massive fanfare. When it first aired on January 31st, 1999, following the Super Bowl 33 broadcast, the show had an enormous built-in audience. Fox had strategically placed the pilot episode right after one of the most watched television events of the year. Tens of millions of people saw that first episode simply because they were already sitting there with their televisions on, and the ratings were genuinely impressive in that initial window. But what followed in the regular time slot was a much more complicated picture. The show was not an immediate runaway hit in the traditional sense. It was a slow burn, a complicated and contested early life that would eventually lead to one of the most dramatic stories in television history. We will get to that part later. But understanding that the Super Bowl launch was both a massive blessing and a complicated setup is important context for everything that follows. Now let's talk about the actual content of Season 1, because there are specific episode details and behind-the-scenes facts that most people have never heard. The first season was only 7 episodes long. 7. In an era when most network television seasons ran upward of 20 episodes, Fox gave Family Guy just 7 episodes to make its case. This is actually crucial to understanding the creative decisions made in those early episodes. The writers and MacFarlane knew they were working with an extremely tight window to establish these characters, establish the world, and establish the show's comedic voice. Every single episode in that first season carried enormous weight because there was no room for filler. There was no throwaway episode in a 7-episode season. Each installment had to pull its weight. And when you rewatch Season 1 with that knowledge, you start noticing how intentional the character introductions feel. The pilot episode, Death Has a Shadow, does something genuinely smart from a storytelling perspective. It establishes Peter as someone who makes catastrophically bad decisions but means well. It shows Lois as the more capable and grounded partner. It introduces the kids with their defining characteristics already in place, and it uses Brian as the voice of reason. All of that happens in a single episode. The show did not take 3 or 4 episodes to find its footing in terms of character definition. It walked in already knowing who these people were. That level of clarity in a pilot episode is rarer than you might think. One of the things that surprises people when they go back to season 1 is how different the animation looks compared to what the show became. The early episodes have a noticeably rougher quality, slightly different character proportions, and a visual style that feels a bit more tentative than the polished look the show developed in later seasons. This is actually completely normal for animated shows, which go through enormous visual evolution over their runs. But the degree of change between Season 1 Family Guy and the show in its later years is striking when you put them side by side. Characters look subtly but distinctly different. The color palette is slightly different. Even the way scenes are staged feels a little less confident than what came later. This is worth paying attention to because it reminds you that you were watching a creative team that was still figuring out its own visual language in real time. Let's talk about Stewie Griffin for a moment, because the character in Season 1 is genuinely fascinating and quite different from what he eventually became. In those first 7 episodes, Stewie is played almost entirely straight as a legitimate villain. His plots for world domination are presented as real threats within the logic of the show. His contempt for Lois is visceral and played with actual menace. The joke is partly that this infant is homicidal and megalomaniacal, but the creative team was fully committed to letting Stewie be genuinely sinister. There is a darkness to early Stewie that the show gradually softened over time as the character became more of a comedic foil and eventually evolved into the version that most modern viewers know, which leans much harder into his flamboyance and his relationship with Brian. But in Season 1, Stewie was conceived and executed as a character with genuine menace, and that original intention gives those early episodes a distinct energy. Here is something that will actually blow your mind if you have never thought about it before. When Family Guy premiered, The Simpsons had already been on the air for 10 years. 10 years of establishing what an animated primetime family comedy could be, what it should look like, and what audiences expected from it. MacFarlane and his team were launching into a landscape where The Simpsons had essentially defined the entire genre. The critical comparisons were immediate and relentless. But critics in 1999 overwhelmingly described Family Guy as a Simpsons knockoff, as derivative, as a lesser imitation of something that had already been done better. These reviews were brutal in some cases, genuinely dismissive, and they reflected a media environment that was not particularly interested in giving the show the benefit of the doubt. Understanding this critical reception context is important because it shaped everything that followed. The show launched under a cloud of critical skepticism that it would spend years fighting against, and yet the audience response was genuinely different from the critical response. While critics were largely underwhelmed, viewers who actually watched those early episodes found something in Family Guy that kept them coming back. The humor style was different from The Simpsons in ways that mattered to a specific generation. The cutaway gag structure, where the show would interrupt itself to show a completely unrelated comedic scenario referenced by the dialogue, was becoming the show's most distinctive formal innovation. This was not The Simpsons format. This was something new. Something that reflected a different comedic sensibility, one rooted in a more chaotic, absurdist, pop culture-saturated worldview. The cutaway gag would eventually become so associated with Family Guy that it became both the show's signature and one of the most debated elements of its style. But in Season 1, it was still fresh and genuinely surprising as a structural choice. Let me give you a specific fact about the production of Season 1 that very few casual fans know. The show operated on a relatively small budget by network television standards for animation, and this had real creative consequences. The team had to be extremely strategic about what they could accomplish visually, which is part of why the writing became so central to the show's identity. When you cannot rely on visual spectacle, you lean into verbal comedy, into timing, into character voice. The constraints of the early budget actually pushed the creative team toward the things that would become the show's greatest strengths. It's a classic example of limitation breeding creativity. The jokes had to be sharp because the visuals could not carry the load on their own. Now, here is something that connects directly to modern pop culture in a way that will feel relevant to you right now in 2026. Family Guy. Season 1 is actually one of the earliest examples of a show that built its cultural footprint almost entirely outside of traditional media channels. Before social media existed, before YouTube existed, before any of the platforms we use today to share and discuss content, the Family Guy was spreading through pirated downloads, through DVD copies passed between friends, through people recording episodes on VHS and sharing them. The show built its cult following in the early internet era, through some of the earliest peer-to-peer file-sharing technologies. This was genuinely novel at the time. Family Guy was one of the first shows to demonstrate that television audiences could be assembled and maintained outside of traditional broadcast metrics. This history makes it a fascinating precursor to how we consume and share content today. But we need to talk about what happened next, because the story of Family Guy after Season 1 is one of the most dramatic in television history, and it is completely inseparable from understanding why Season 1 matters so much. After the show completed its initial run and moved into subsequent seasons, Fox canceled Family Guy in 2002. Canceled. The show was done. Finished. It was pulled from the schedule and appeared to be gone permanently. By conventional wisdom at the time, that should have been the end of the story. Most canceled shows from that era simply disappeared. Their casts moved on, their creators developed new projects, and audiences found new things to watch. That is the normal trajectory. Family Guy did not follow the normal trajectory. What happened instead was that Adult Swim, the late-night programming block on Cartoon Network, began airing reruns of Family Guy. And something remarkable happened. The ratings for these reruns were extraordinary. A show that Fox had deemed not commercially viable enough to keep on the air was pulling in massive numbers when replayed on a cable channel aimed at young adults watching late at night. This proved something fundamental about Family Guy's audience. The people who loved the show were intensely loyal and would seek it out whenever and wherever it was available. They were not passive viewers who would tune in at whatever time the network told them to. They were active fans who genuinely wanted more of the content. The DVD releases added another dimension to this phenomenon. When Family Guy's seasons became available on DVD, they sold extraordinarily well. These sales provided concrete commercial evidence that there was a substantial audience willing to spend money on this show. And that combination, strong Adult Swim ratings plus strong DVD sales, is what convinced Fox to do something almost unprecedented in television history. They brought Family Guy back. The show was uncanceled and returned to television in 2005, making it one of the very few shows in American television history to be canceled and then genuinely revived because of audience demand. Without Season 1, without those 7 episodes establishing the world and the characters and the voice that would hook a generation of viewers, none of that revival story happens. Season 1 is the foundation that everything else was built on. Now let's get into some of the more specific and surprising details about individual episodes from Season 1, because this is where things get really granular and really interesting for the true fans. The second episode of Season 1, titled I Never Met the Dead Man, features a plot centered on Peter accidentally destroying the town's cable television signal and the Griffin family being forced to find other ways to entertain themselves. What is fascinating about this episode in retrospect is how it functions as a meditation on television dependency and the role of media in family life. For a show that would go on to spend much of its existence commenting on and parodying other television content, this early episode about what happens when television disappears is almost self-aware in an interesting way. The Griffins are genuinely lost without their screen time. And the comedy of the episode comes from their inability to function as a family unit without the mediation of entertainment. It is funnier and smarter than it initially appears. The third episode, Chitty Chitty Death Bang, introduces some genuinely dark comedic territory around Stewie's backstory and his cult connections. And it also includes one of the season's strongest early demonstrations of Meg's role in the family dynamic. Meg, in Season 1, is treated as the overlooked middle child. The teenager whose experiences and feelings are consistently deprioritized by her parents in favor of whatever crisis Peter has created this week. This treatment of Meg would become more extreme and more deliberately cruel as the show progressed. But in Season 1, there is still something almost sympathetic about how her storylines are constructed. She is recognizably a teenager trying to figure out who she is. And the show has some genuine warmth in how it approaches her character in these early episodes. Warmth that would become increasingly complicated in later seasons. Something that genuinely surprises people when they look into the production of Season 1 is how much of the voice cast established in those 7 episodes would remain with the show for its entire subsequent run. Seth MacFarlane himself voices Peter, Stewie, Brian, and Quagmire, which is an extraordinary range for a single performer to maintain across a long-running series. Alex Borstein as Lois, Mila Kunis as Meg, Seth Green as Chris, and Mike Henry in various roles were all present from the beginning. The core cast was fully assembled in Season 1, and that core would hold together through decades of production. This kind of cast stability is genuinely unusual in long-running television, and it speaks to the strength of the creative relationships that were established in those early episodes. When you hear those voices in Season 1, you are hearing the definitive versions of those characters, the voices that would define them forever. Here is a fact about the show's cultural context in 1999 that adds another layer to understanding Season 1. The late 1990s were a specific and interesting moment in American comedy. The culture was digesting years of postmodern irony, the kind of self-aware humor that had defined so much of the decade's comedy. Shows like Seinfeld had built enormous audiences around detached, ironic characters who treated everything with a certain emotional distance. Family Guy arrived in this context and did something slightly different. It embraced a kind of maximalist absurdism that went beyond irony into something more chaotic and unpredictable. The cutaway gags are not ironic in the traditional sense. They are genuinely weird, genuinely committed to their own internal logic in the moment, and then instantly abandoned. This was a different flavor of postmodern comedy, one that would feel increasingly at home in the internet era that was just beginning to emerge as Season 1 aired. Let me tell you something about the physical production of animated content in 1999 that most people never think about. Animation in the late 1990s was still largely done using traditional methods that required enormous amounts of physical labor. The transition to digital animation was happening but was not yet complete, and shows like Family Guy occupied a complicated middle ground between traditional and digital techniques. The rough quality visible in Season 1 is partly a function of where the technology was at the time, and partly a function of the budget constraints we discussed earlier. When you watch those early episodes, you are seeing animation produced at the very tail end of one era of production and the very beginning of another. It is a historical artifact in its visual style, completely apart from whatever you think about the content. Now, I want to address something that often comes up when people discuss Season 1 in comparison to the later show, and that is the question of how boundaries were being tested, even in those very first episodes. Family Guy, from its very first episode, pushed against what was acceptable on network television in ways that were genuinely provocative for 1999. The show was not operating in the same cultural moment as it would in its post-revival years when it became famous for extreme boundary pushing. In Season 1, the provocations were subtler, but they were present. Jokes that referenced adult themes, humor that relied on the audience being in on something slightly transgressive. A willingness to go to uncomfortable places that most family-friendly animation avoided. This was deliberate. MacFarlane and his team were establishing from day one that this was not a safe show, that it was going to challenge its audience's expectations about what animated comedy could do. One of the most striking things about rewatching Season 1 today is how much the show was already commenting on suburban American life, in ways that feel remarkably consistent across its entire run. Quahog, Rhode Island, the fictional town where the Griffins live, is established in those first 7 episodes as a very specific kind of American place. It is working class but aspirational, economically anxious, socially stratified in ways that everyone pretends do not exist, and full of people who are defined as much by their limitations as by their ambitions. Peter Griffin is not a wealthy man. He is a factory worker, later working in other jobs, but always rooted in a class position that the show takes seriously, even when it is making jokes. The economic reality of the Griffin household is present in Season 1 in ways that give the comedy an edge that pure fantasy settings cannot provide. Brian Griffin's character in Season 1 is worth examining more closely because the choices made in those early episodes about who Brian is would have enormous consequences for everything the character became. Brian is a dog who talks, who drinks martinis, who has pretensions to being a serious writer, who sees himself as more sophisticated and culturally aware than the rest of his family. This is inherently comedic because the gap between Brian's self-image and reality is visible to the audience even when it is not visible to Brian himself. But in Season 1, this gap is handled with a little more subtlety than it would be in later years. Early Brian has genuine moments of insight and genuine moments of connection with other characters that make him sympathetic rather than just a target for jokes about his pretension. The character is more fully human, so to speak, in those early episodes, and that humanity is what made viewers care about him enough for his later development to matter. Let's talk about something that connects Season 1 to the broader landscape of television history in a way that I find genuinely fascinating. The late 1990s were a transitional moment for animation in prime time. The Simpsons had proven the format could work for adults. King of the Hill had demonstrated that animated comedy could be relatively grounded and still find a large audience. South Park had exploded onto cable television and completely redefined what animated comedy could say and do. Family Guy arrived in this context and needed to find its own space within a suddenly crowded landscape. McFarlane's solution was to create something that was simultaneously more pop culture saturated than The Simpsons, more absurdist than King of the Hill, and more willing to go to genuinely dark comedic places while remaining on network television rather than cable. This was a specific and calculated creative positioning, and you can see it in every episode of Season 1. There is a specific creative choice made in Season 1 that almost nobody talks about, but which I think is incredibly important for understanding the show's DNA. The Griffin family is, structurally, a deeply dysfunctional unit. But the dysfunction is never presented as tragic. Unlike some later animated shows that would explore family dysfunction with genuine emotional weight and consequences, Family Guy Season 1 establishes a tone where the chaos is essentially self-contained and self-resetting. Each episode ends with the family essentially intact, no worse for wear, ready to begin the next episode fresh. This is a very specific tonal choice, one that prioritizes comedy over consequence, and it defines the show's relationship with its own universe in a way that separates it from more character development-focused contemporaries. It is a choice that has been both celebrated and criticized over the years, but it was made in Season 1 and it has never really changed. All right. Here is one of the most genuinely surprising production facts about Season 1 that I want to make sure you hear clearly. Seth MacFarlane very nearly missed the flight that would have taken him to work on the morning of September 11th, 2001. Now this happened after Season 1, but the fact that MacFarlane was alive to shepherd his show through its complicated early years and eventual revival is something that a lot of people find genuinely striking when they learn it. His survival and continued involvement with the show is one of those historical footnotes that makes you think about how differently things could have gone, not just for MacFarlane personally, but for Family Guy, as a franchise and cultural phenomenon. The show's entire post-Season 1 history, the cancellation, the revival, the decades of subsequent episodes, all of it depended on MacFarlane being alive and able to do the work. Let me now circle back to something I touched on earlier about the Super Bowl premiere, because there is a detail here that really illustrates how specific the business decisions around Season 1 were. Fox's choice to premiere Family Guy after Super Bowl 33 was not an accident or a gesture of goodwill toward a promising new show. It was a calculated bet. Fox had a significant financial and creative investment in McFarlane's project, and they needed to give it the best possible launch conditions. The Super Bowl slot was the biggest possible spotlight they could offer. The fact that they offered it to an animated comedy, a format that was still finding its audience for adults, speaks to how much confidence the network had in what they had seen from McFarlane's team. That confidence was not entirely validated by the show's subsequent rating struggles. But the initial act of faith represented by that premiere slot is historically significant. Now, as we approach the end of this deep dive, I want to bring everything back to why Season 1 of Family Guy matters today, in 2026, when the show has been on the air for more than 2 decades with breaks and revivals, and has become one of the most globally recognized animated brands in television history. The reason Season 1 matters is that it represents a moment of genuine creative ambition and risk. McFarlane was a 24-year-old making his first major television project, working with a small team on a limited budget in the shadow of The Simpsons, launching against critical skepticism, trying to establish something that had never quite been done in the way he wanted to do it. Season 1 is the document of that attempt. It is imperfect in all the ways that first seasons of great shows are imperfect. The animation is rougher. Some of the jokes are less precisely calibrated than what the show would eventually produce. Some of the character dynamics are still finding their final form. But the energy of those 7 episodes is irreplaceable. There is something in Season 1 of Family Guy that later seasons, for all their polish and confidence and bigger budgets and more refined storytelling, cannot quite replicate. It is the energy of something being invented in real time, of a creative team discovering what their show is capable of through the actual act of making it. When you watch Death Has a Shadow with that context in mind, you are watching a group of talented people taking a real creative risk, and mostly pulling it off in front of an audience of tens of millions. That is remarkable regardless of what you think about the show's humor or its cultural legacy. Here is my final surprising fact for you, and I think it might be the one that really sticks. If you add up the total runtime of Season 1 of Family Guy, 7 episodes at roughly 22 minutes each, you get less than 3 hours of television. Less than 3 hours of content launched a franchise that has generated billions of dollars, spawned multiple spin-offs, defined the comedic sensibilities of an entire generation, influenced the structure of internet humor in ways that are still being debated, and demonstrated that audience loyalty is a more powerful force than network ratings metrics could ever measure. Less than 3 hours of animated television about a not particularly bright man from Rhode Island and his talking dog and his cartoonishly villainous baby changed the landscape of American comedy. That is not an exaggeration. That is just what happened. So if you have never gone back and watched those first 7 episodes with fresh eyes and the knowledge of everything I have shared with you today, I genuinely think you should. Watch them knowing that Seth MacFarlane was 24 years old. Watch them knowing the critical reception was brutal. Watch them knowing that the show would be canceled, revived, and go on to run for decades. Watch them knowing that Stewie was originally meant to be taken seriously as a villain. Watch them knowing that the cutaway gag format was an innovation, not just a quirk. Watch them knowing that the rough animation you see was produced during a transitional moment in animation technology. Watch them with all of that context and tell me they do not feel different, richer, more interesting than they did before. If this video gave you at least one fact you genuinely did not know, I want to hear about it in the comments. Which one hit you the hardest? Which one are you going to tell your friends about? Because I really do love hearing from people who are as genuinely fascinated by the history of television and pop culture as I am. And if you want more deep dives like this one, more videos that go past the surface level of the things you think you already know, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications because I have got more coming that you are absolutely not going to want to miss. Thanks for being here, and I will see you in the next one. So here's something that most Family Guy fans have absolutely no idea about. And honestly, when I found out, I had to sit down for a second because it completely changed the way I watched the show. Family Guy almost ended permanently, not once, but twice. And the second time it came back, it broke a record that nobody in television history had ever come close to touching. But before we get into that, let me just say this right now. If you think you know everything about Family Guy, I promise you, no, By the end of this video, you will have learned at least 5 things that genuinely surprise you. And if you make it to the end, I saved the wildest one for last, and it involves Seth MacFarlane himself in a way that is almost impossible to believe. Stay with me. Family Guy premiered on January 31st, 1999. That seems like a pretty simple fact, right? But what most people overlook is the context of when that show was born. The Simpsons had already been running for almost a decade. South Park had just exploded onto the scene. Animation was having this massive cultural moment, and Fox decided to take a bet on a 24-year-old kid from Kent, Connecticut, who had pitched them a show based on a short film he made in college. That kid was Seth MacFarlane, and at the time, he was the youngest person in the history of American television to ever have a network animated series greenlit. He was 24 years old. Let that sink in. Most 24-year-olds are still figuring out what they want to do with their lives, and this man was creating one of the most recognizable animated franchises in the history of television. Now, the show did reasonably well at first. It had a dedicated fan base, decent ratings, and critical recognition in those early seasons. Family Guy was actually nominated for an Emmy for Outstanding Comedy Series in its second season. Not an animated comedy Emmy. The main Outstanding Comedy Series category. That is a nomination that puts it alongside shows like Frasier and Everybody Loves Raymond. Most people forget that Family Guy was considered a genuinely prestige comedy at one point, not just the irreverent chaos machine it later became in the cultural memory. But here is where the story starts to get interesting, and this is the first major shock for a lot of fans. Fox canceled Family Guy in 2002. That is not the shocking part because most fans know that. The shocking part is why. The cancellation was not primarily about ratings being terrible in the traditional sense. What happened was a combination of factors, including scheduling issues where Fox kept moving the show around to different time slots, preemptions during football season that completely disrupted the viewership numbers, and a general sense from executives that the show had peaked. Fox moved it, buried it, Mark cut its episode orders, and then officially pulled the plug. At the time, it genuinely seemed like it was over. Cast members moved on, the creative team dispersed, Seth MacFarlane went on to develop other projects, and then something happened that nobody predicted. DVD sales. In the early 2000s, DVD box sets were becoming a genuinely massive business, and when Family Guy Seasons 1 and 2 dropped as a DVD package, they sold at a pace that stunned the entertainment industry. We are talking about multiple millions of units sold, putting it consistently among the top-selling DVD releases of that period. Simultaneously, Cartoon Network's Adult Swim block started airing reruns of the canceled show, and those reruns pulled in ratings that were competitive with original programming across all of cable television. Adult Swim was airing a dead show, and it was beating live content. Fox executives, watching all of this data pour in, made a decision that was historically unprecedented. They unrenewed the cancellation. They brought Family Guy back from the dead in 2005, and the comeback season, Season 4, became one of the most watched animated premieres in Fox history at that time. That is the record I mentioned at the beginning. No canceled American television series had ever been brought back purely on the strength of DVD sales and cable reruns, without any new content existing. Family Guy did it. And it completely changed how the entertainment industry thought about canceled properties. If you have ever wondered why studios and networks now pay such close attention to streaming numbers and home media sales for canceled shows, Family Guy is a huge reason why. This show literally rewrote the playbook. Now let me give you a value drop right here, because this next fact is one that I think even the most dedicated fans often get wrong when they recall it. The character of Stewie Griffin was originally written with a very specific long-term arc in mind. In the early seasons, Stewie's obsession with killing Lois and his elaborate schemes for world domination were not just random comedic beats. The original creative vision had Stewie eventually revealing that he was gay, and that a significant portion of his aggression toward Lois was rooted in the internal conflict of being a young character struggling with identity in a household that he perceived as suffocating. Now, the show never explicitly committed to this in a formal narrative way during those early seasons. But Seth MacFarlane has discussed in multiple interviews how Stewie's character evolved organically rather than following a deliberate plan. The openly flamboyant, campy version of Stewie that most fans know from the later seasons is very different from the cold, calculating, genuinely menacing villain character that appeared in the pilot and first season. Watch the first season Stewie, and then watch a season 10 Stewie back to back, and you will genuinely feel like you are watching two different characters wearing the same face. The voice work behind Family Guy is something that deserves its own extended conversation. But let me hit you with a specific fact that tends to blow people away. Seth MacFarlane voices Peter Griffin, Stewie Griffin, Quagmire, and Brian Griffin as main characters in the show. He also provides dozens of recurring and background character voices throughout the series. The sheer volume of voice work he produces per episode is remarkable, but here is the specific detail that gets people. Brian Griffin's voice is actually the closest voice to Seth MacFarlane's natural speaking voice. Peter, Stewie, and Quagmire all require significant vocal manipulation and character work. Brian is essentially Seth MacFarlane talking in a slightly measured, slightly elevated register. In interviews and public appearances, when you listen to MacFarlane speak naturally, Brian is right there, which means that in many ways, Brian is the character that most directly channels MacFarlane's own opinions, humor, and worldview. Many television analysts have pointed out over the years that Brian often serves as a mouthpiece for MacFarlane's actual political and cultural views, and knowing that the voice is the closest to his natural one adds an extra layer to that interpretation. Let me talk about the writer's room because the talent that came out of Family Guy is genuinely extraordinary. And most casual fans have no appreciation for how significant the show's legacy is as a launching pad for careers. Alex Sulkin, Mike Barker, Cherry Shevapravat-Dumrong, and several other writers who spent significant time in the Family Guy writer's room have gone on to produce and create their own major projects across film and television. But the name that always hits hardest when I bring it up is this: Daniel Palladino, who co-created The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel with his wife Amy Sherman Palladino, worked as a writer and producer on Family Guy in the early seasons. The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel is one of the most critically acclaimed dramas of the streaming era, a show with a completely opposite tone, sensibility, and audience from Family Guy, and one of its creative architects came out of that Quahog writer's room. That is a wild connection that almost nobody ever brings up. Now I want to pause here and acknowledge something because we are deep into this video, and I want to make sure I am giving you substance with every single point I make. Here is one that specifically relates to the cultural impact of the show in a way that goes beyond just entertainment. Family Guy, particularly in its later seasons, has been the subject of serious academic study. Multiple papers published in Communications, the Media Studies, and even sociology journals have analyzed the show's relationship with political satire, its commentary on American suburban culture, and its use of what academics call cutaway gags as a distinct narrative device. The cutaway gag, that thing where the show suddenly jumps to a completely unrelated scene for 30 seconds to illustrate a joke, was not invented by Family Guy, but Family Guy industrialized it. The show turned the cutaway into such a signature device that it is now inseparable from the show's identity in a way that has influenced comedy writing across the entire industry. Shows, films, social media content creators, and comedians regularly employ the basic structural logic of the cutaway gag, often without even being conscious that they are borrowing from a template that Family Guy helped normalize. Here is another one that tends to genuinely surprise people. A Family Guy has a deeper connection to actual musical theater and performance arts than almost any other animated comedy in television history. Seth MacFarlane is a legitimately trained singer with classical technique who has released multiple full-length albums covering American standards, the kind of mid-century music associated with Frank Sinatra and Tony Bennett. He has performed at Carnegie Hall. He has hosted the Academy Awards. The musical numbers in Family Guy are not just parody filler. They are often crafted with genuine compositional care, and many of the original songs written for the show have been performed live in concert settings with full orchestras. There have been live touring productions of Family Guy in concert where an orchestra performs the show's original music live while episodes are screened. This is a level of musical legitimacy that separates Family Guy from virtually every other animated comedy that attempts musical humor. The episode that comes up most often when people discuss the show's most ambitious moments is Road to the Multiverse, the Season 8 episode that parodies different animation styles. That episode features sequences animated in the style of classic Disney films, anime, classic Hanna-Barbera cartoons, and hyper-realistic CGI, all within a single episode. The production cost and coordination required to pull that off was enormous, now requiring collaboration with animators who had genuine expertise in each specific style being parodied. The Disney sequence in particular required the creative team to study the specific principles of Golden Age Disney animation in detail, including the particular ways characters moved, the color palettes used, and the harmonic structures of the background music. That episode is often held up in animation circles as a technically impressive achievement, separate from whatever you think of Family Guy as a comedy. Now I want to hit you with something that is going to genuinely reshape how you think about one of the most memorable moments in the show's entire history. The episode Partial Terms of Endearment, the episode where Lois becomes a surrogate mother, was actually banned from airing in the United States when it was originally produced. Fox refused to air it entirely. It was broadcast in the United Kingdom before it ever aired in America. When it eventually made its way to American audiences, it was through DVD and later streaming, becoming one of the only Family Guy episodes that literally went overseas first because a major American network refused to broadcast it domestically. The subject matter, which dealt directly and explicitly with abortion and surrogacy from multiple perspectives, was considered too politically sensitive for Fox to put on the air. Seth MacFarlane has been very open about his frustration with that decision because his view was that the episode was not taking a side, but rather exploring the genuine complexity of the issue. Whether you agree with that characterization or not, the fact that a Family Guy episode was effectively banned from American broadcast television is a remarkable footnote in the show's history. Let me give you the next layer now because I think the career trajectory around this show is one of the most fascinating elements of the whole story. Before Family Guy, before Seth MacFarlane was a household name, he was creating animated content for Hanna-Barbera while still in college. He attended the Rhode Island School of Design, which is one of the most prestigious art schools in the world, and while still a student there, he was already doing professional animation work for a major studio. By the time he graduated, he had developed the short films that would eventually form the conceptual foundation for Family Guy. The speed at which he went from student animator to network television showrunner is almost impossible to compress into a believable timeline. He pitched Family Guy to Fox, received development funding, and was producing the actual series within a timeline that veterans of the television industry still describe as essentially unprecedented. What made it even more complicated is that during the production of early Family Guy seasons, MacFarlane was simultaneously developing American Dad, which would premiere on Fox in 2005. So not only was he running Family Guy, but he was also in development on a second animated series that would go on to have its own long and successful run. Running two concurrent animated series simultaneously is not unheard of, but doing it while also serving as a primary voice actor on both projects and maintaining the creative vision for each is an extraordinary workload that rarely gets properly acknowledged. Here is something that specifically relates to the animation production process that most viewers never think about. Family Guy is produced with a very significant international component in its animation pipeline. The actual drawing and frame-by-frame animation work has historically been done in South Korea, which is standard practice across much of the American animation industry. But what is specific to Family Guy is the sheer volume of content that has to be produced per season, and the communication pipeline between the American creative team and the Korean animation studios has to be extraordinarily precise. Any ambiguity in a direction or a character note can result in animation that misses the comedic timing by fractions of a second. And in comedy, especially animated comedy, fractions of a second can make the difference between a joke that lands perfectly and one that falls completely flat. The coordination required to maintain comedic timing across a production pipeline that spans continents and operates through detailed written and visual notes is something that animation professionals cite as one of the genuine craft challenges of producing a show like this consistently. Now let me get into the specific facts about episodes and moments that have had real-world consequences beyond entertainment. There was an episode of Family Guy that predicted a specific major event before it happened, and this one has been discussed extensively online, but I want to make sure I give you the correct version because there is a lot of misinformation floating around about it. In a 2011 episode, the show referenced the Boston Marathon in the context of a joke. The Boston Marathon bombing occurred in 2013. The episode was not a prediction in any prophetic sense. What actually happened was a darker and more complicated story. After the bombing, someone edited footage from the episode together in a deceptive way to make it appear as though the show had specifically depicted a bombing, which it had not. The manipulated video spread widely online and caused significant real harm, prompting Fox to temporarily pull the episode from streaming and other platforms while the situation was sorted out. Seth MacFarlane directly addressed it publicly, expressing genuine distress about the manipulated content. The actual episode had nothing to do with a bombing, but the edited version spread so quickly in the immediate aftermath of a genuine tragedy that it created a media crisis around the show. That chain of events is a genuinely important early case study in how misinformation can spread through social media around traumatic events. I want to give you one of the deeper-cut cultural facts now because I think this is the kind of thing that truly dedicated fans appreciate. Family Guy has a long and complicated relationship with the writers and producers of The Simpsons. There is a documented creative tension between the two camps that dates back to Family Guy's premiere, with Simpsons creator Matt Groening having made no secret of his negative view of Family Guy's humor style and his feeling that the show borrowed too liberally from what The Simpsons had built. MacFarlane and the Family Guy team have acknowledged The Simpsons' influence while defending their own distinct voice. This tension eventually became fodder for one of the most talked-about crossover events in animated television history when Family Guy and The Simpsons did an official crossover episode in 2014. The episode called The Simpsons Guy, which explicitly addressed the rivalry and similarities between the two shows within the narrative itself. The Simpsons Guy is the longest episode in Family Guy history, running approximately 45 minutes, and it directly parodies its own meta-situation, including a scene where Peter and Homer argue over whose show is better while fighting each other, which is genuinely one of the most self-aware moments in the history of animated television. Let me bring up the international dimension of Family Guy's success, because this is underappreciated. The show has been dubbed into dozens of languages for international broadcast, but what makes it particularly complex is that many of the show's jokes are deeply embedded in American cultural references, including specific regional American humor, references to American political figures and institutions, and jokes that rely on understanding specific American social dynamics. This creates a translation and cultural adaptation challenge that localization teams for the show have to navigate episode by episode. In some international markets, entire jokes have to be replaced wholesale with completely different jokes that carry a similar comedic energy, but reference cultural touchstones that are recognizable to the local audience. The version of Family Guy that viewers in Germany, Japan, or Brazil are watching is in certain episodes substantially different from what American audiences see, not just in language, but in actual comedic content. Here is another fact that I find consistently fascinating and that tends to generate strong reactions when I bring it up. The character of Meg Griffin has become the show's most analyzed character from a writing and representation perspective. For most of the show's run, Meg exists as a character who is the target of constant mockery, dismissal, and cruelty from her own family and from the broader Quahog social world. So, What makes this interesting from a critical perspective is that the show has at various points in its later seasons deliberately acknowledged this pattern and used it for specific dramatic and comedic commentary. There is a notable moment in a Season 9 episode where Meg directly confronts her family about how they treat her. And, for a brief window, the episode treats this confrontation with genuine emotional weight before the show essentially snaps back to its normal dynamic. That tonal shift, where a show famous for refusing to take anything seriously suddenly does take something seriously for a moment, is considered by many television analysts to be one of the more emotionally interesting things Family Guy has ever done. It creates a crack in the comedic armor that makes you aware of the actual human underneath the punchline. Now, here is where I want to shift into the territory that is genuinely jaw-dropping, because we talked at the top of this video about something involving Seth MacFarlane personally that is almost impossible to believe, and I have been building toward it this entire video. On September 11, 2001, Seth MacFarlane was booked on American Airlines Flight 11. That is the first plane that struck the World Trade Center. He was not on the flight. His travel agent had given him an incorrect departure time, and he was hungover from the night before, arriving at the gate approximately 10 minutes after the plane had already left. Seth MacFarlane missed the flight that killed every single person on board by approximately 10 minutes because of a scheduling miscommunication and the aftermath of a late night out. He has spoken about this in interviews with a kind of matter-of-fact acknowledgement that carries something underneath it that you can hear even when he is being measured and composed about it. One of the most successful people in American animation and entertainment history nearly did not survive to make a single episode of the show that defined a generation of comedy. Family Guy, as most of us know it, the revival seasons, American Dad, The Orville, his film work, the concerts and albums. Essentially all of it happens downstream of a 10-minute delay. That is the kind of fact that genuinely makes you stop and sit with it for a moment. Let me come back to some more show-specific content because I want to make sure we are giving you the full picture here. One of the things that separates Family Guy from most animated comedies in terms of sheer ambition is the number of full episode parody specials the show has produced. Blue Harvest, which is a Star Wars parody, was a full 45-minute episode that parodied A New Hope in genuine detail. It was followed by Something 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 Dark Side and It Is a Trap, completing a parody trilogy of the original Star Wars films. The production of these episodes required obtaining detailed licensing approvals from Lucasfilm and involved a level of production design and scoring that went well beyond what the average Family Guy episode required. When Blue Harvest aired in 2007, it drew one of the largest audiences in the show's history at that point. The Star Wars trilogy parody episodes are often cited by animation professionals as examples of ambitious production within the format of a regular television episode schedule. The sheer longevity of Family Guy is itself a remarkable fact that deserves more reflection than it usually gets. The show premiered in 1999. As of today, in March 2026, the show has been producing content for nearly 3 decades with a gap in the middle. Characters who were children in the original run have been children for over 25 years of broadcast time. In-universe, the Griffins have experienced an almost incomprehensible volume of events, while remaining essentially unchanged in their fundamental dynamics. This kind of narrative stasis is a feature of most long-running animated comedies rather than a bug, and Family Guy has operated within that tradition while occasionally attempting to introduce genuine character development, and usually retreating from it by the next episode. The tension between wanting to create meaningful character moments and needing to reset for comedic consistency is something that the writers have openly discussed over the years as one of the ongoing creative challenges of the show. One more specific production fact before we start wrapping this up. The music for Family Guy is composed by a rotating group of composers and arrangers, but the show's main theme, the famous opening number, was written by Walter Murphy, who is a composer best known for his disco orchestration of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony that became a massive hit in the 1970s. That particular bit of composer trivia is one of those connection points that feels completely random until you realize that Family Guy is absolutely the kind of show that would have the composer of a disco Beethoven hit writing its theme music. And then it feels completely perfect. There are dozens more facts we could spend time on. The guest star list over the years includes essentially every major celebrity in American entertainment spanning 3 decades. The show has directly commented on its own network's parent company in ways that have reportedly caused genuine friction with Fox's corporate structure. The animation style has subtly evolved over the seasons in ways that animation students can clock, but casual viewers do not consciously notice. The show has dealt with genuinely serious social issues, including addiction, grief, and identity, in episodes that surprised audiences who expected nothing but pure irreverence. But let me close with this, because I think it is the most important perspective to bring to all of these facts. Family Guy has survived cancellation, controversy, critical dismissal, cultural shifts, the streaming revolution, changes in what comedy is considered acceptable, and the complete transformation of the television landscape. It has done this by being genuinely flexible in its identity, while maintaining enough core consistency to remain recognizable. Whether you love it, have complicated feelings about it, or gave up on it somewhere around season 12, it is essentially undeniable that Family Guy has been one of the most influential forces in American comedy for the past 25 years. The shows you watch, the memes you share, the way comedians structure certain kinds of jokes, all of it carries some fingerprint of what Family Guy built and popularized, and sometimes controversially pushed forward. The 10 minutes that saved Seth MacFarlane's life gave the world all of that. Every cutaway gag, every musical number, every time Stewie said something that made you uncomfortable and then laugh and then feel guilty for laughing. Every road to episode. Every moment where Brian and Stewie ended up in some bizarre emotional situation that had no right being as touching as it was. All of it came from a decade and a half of work by a team of people who built something out of a canceled property that nobody expected to ever breathe again. If this video changed how you see the show even slightly, or if you learned something you genuinely did not know before, hit that like button right now because it genuinely helps this channel more than most people realize. If you want to go deeper into animated television history, Hollywood stories that sound too crazy to be true, or entertainment facts that reframe things you thought you already understood, subscribe and hit the notification bell because this is exactly the kind of content we do here consistently. And leave me a comment right now telling me which fact in this video surprised you the most. I am genuinely curious whether this September 11th story hits hardest, or whether it is something else entirely. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. I will see you in the next one. Alright, let me ask you something. How many hours of Family Guy have you actually watched in your lifetime? If you've been a fan since the beginning, we're probably talking hundreds of hours. Maybe more. And yet, I can almost guarantee that by the end of this video, you're going to learn something about this show that you had absolutely no idea about. Something that's going to make you look at Family Guy in a completely different way. Because this show has secrets. Deep ones, weird ones, some that are genuinely shocking when you hear them for the first time. And we're going to go through all of them today. So stick around, because we're just getting started, and this is going to be a wild ride. Family Guy first aired on January 31st, 1999. Now that alone isn't surprising. Most fans know that. But what most fans don't know is how close this show came to never existing at all. Seth MacFarlane, the creator, was actually scheduled to be on one of the flights that was hijacked on September 11th, 2001. His travel agent gave him the wrong departure time, which caused him to miss his flight. That flight was American Airlines Flight 11, which was the first plane to hit the World Trade Center. Now, this isn't directly connected to the creation of the show since Family Guy already existed by that point. But it puts into perspective just how different television history could have looked. The man behind one of the most influential animated shows in history came that close to not being here at all. Let that sink in for a second. Now let's go back to the actual origins of the show, because this is where things get really interesting. Family Guy didn't come from nowhere. It was actually based on a short animated film that Seth MacFarlane made when he was a student at the Rhode Island School of Design. The short was called The Life of Larry, and it featured a character named Larry and his talking dog Steve. Sound familiar? That foundation became the blueprint for what would eventually evolve into the Griffin family and their dog, Brian. MacFarlane shopped the idea around, and Fox took a chance on it. And when Fox takes a chance on something, they really commit, or sometimes they don't. More on that in a moment. Here's something that blows people's minds when they first hear it. Seth MacFarlane does the voices for an enormous chunk of the main cast. We're talking Peter Griffin, Stewie Griffin, Brian Griffin, and Quagmire, all coming from one person. 4 of the most distinctive and memorable animated voices in television history, all produced by the same human vocal cords. And each voice is genuinely different. Not slightly different, completely different in tone, pitch, character, and personality. Peter has that nasal Rhode Island accent. Stewie has that sophisticated British theatrical delivery. Brian sounds like a calm, measured intellectual. And Quagmire has that smooth, sleazy confidence. When you actually stop and think about the vocal range required to pull all 4 of those off in a single recording session, it's genuinely impressive. MacFarlane has said in interviews that he can switch between the voices almost instantly, which is something the recording directors at Fox found incredible when they first heard him do it. Now let's talk about the cancellation, because this is one of the most remarkable comeback stories in television history. Family Guy was canceled by Fox in 2002. Not after a short run either. The show had been going for 3 seasons and Fox pulled the plug. The ratings had been declining, the show was expensive to produce, and the network decided to cut their losses. Most shows that get canceled just fade away. The episodes stop coming, the merchandise dries up, and eventually people just move on. That's the natural life cycle of a canceled television show. But Family Guy refused to die. And the reason it came back is genuinely fascinating. DVD sales. That's the answer. When Family Guy seasons started getting released on DVD, something unexpected happened. People bought them in enormous numbers. We're talking massive sales figures that caught Fox completely off guard. The network had canceled a show thinking audiences had moved on, only to discover that millions of people were actually passionate enough about it to spend real money on the physical discs. And then Cartoon Network picked up the reruns for their Adult Swim programming block, and the ratings there were incredible. Suddenly, Fox realized they had made a significant mistake. They reversed the cancellation and brought the show back in 2005. Family Guy became one of the very few American animated series to be canceled and then successfully revived. And when it came back strong. The Season 4 premiere drew massive viewership, and the show has been running ever since. Now here's something that casual fans might not realize about how this show is actually made. The production timeline for a single episode of Family Guy is staggering. From the initial writing stage all the way through to a finished episode ready for broadcast, we're talking about an average of 9 to 10 months. Nearly a year for 22 minutes of content. The writers have to come up with the concept, break the story, write the script, get it approved, record the voice actors, send the recorded audio and storyboards to the animation studio in South Korea, receive the animated footage back, do the editing, add the music, and go through multiple rounds of revisions and adjustments before anything makes it to air. And this process is happening simultaneously for multiple episodes at once, which means the production team is always juggling a dozen different versions of the show at various stages of completion. It's a logistical operation that most viewers never think about when they're sitting on the couch watching Peter fall down the stairs for the 30th time. Let's talk about the voices some more, because there's a detail here that often gets overlooked. Mila Kunis has voiced Meg Griffin since Season 2, but in Season 1, Meg was voiced by someone else entirely, while Lacey Chabert, who you might know from Mean Girls, was the original voice of Meg Griffin. She left the role at the end of the first season due to scheduling conflicts related to her other work commitments, and Mila Kunis stepped in to take over. The transition happened between seasons, so most viewers who started watching from the beginning barely noticed the change. But if you go back and watch Season 1 episodes and then immediately jump to Season 2, you can hear the difference. Lacey Chabert's Meg sounds slightly different from Mila Kunis's Meg. It's subtle, but it's there. And Lacey Chabert has spoken publicly about leaving the role, saying there were no hard feelings and that she's glad the show found the success it did. Here's a fascinating one about Seth MacFarlane and the way he approaches the humor in the show. A lot of people assume that the cutaway gags, those random flashback sequences where the show just cuts away from the main story to show something completely unrelated, were something that evolved naturally over time. But actually, MacFarlane had that format in mind from very early in the development process. The cutaway gag was a deliberate structural choice designed to allow the show to go places that a traditional narrative couldn't. If you're telling a linear story and a character says something that reminds them of a funny incident, you can either have them tell the story verbally, which takes up dialogue time, or you can literally show the incident as if it's happening. Family Guy chose the latter, and that decision fundamentally changed the language of animated comedy. Shows that came after Family Guy have absolutely borrowed that technique, and you can see the influence in various places across modern comedy animation. Now I want to tell you something about the show's relationship with controversy, because this is genuinely interesting from a cultural perspective. Family Guy has been criticized by just about every group imaginable at some point. Religious organizations, political groups, advocacy groups, networks, critics, you name it. The Parents Television Council, which monitors content on American television, has repeatedly named Family Guy as one of the worst shows on television for families. And Seth MacFarlane has been remarkably consistent in his response to that criticism, which is essentially that the show is not designed for children, that it airs after watershed hours, and that the satire is intended to challenge and provoke thought rather than simply offend for its own sake. Whether you agree with that defense or not, the consistency of the controversy surrounding the show has actually helped it in some ways. There's a long tradition in entertainment of forbidden fruit being more appealing simply because someone told you not to consume it. Every time a watchdog group condemned Family Guy, it probably drove more curious viewers to tune in. Let me give you something that's genuinely going to surprise you. The episode Partial Terms of Endearment, which deals with surrogacy, was actually filmed and completed as part of Season 8 but was never aired on Fox in the United States. Fox refused to broadcast it. The episode eventually got released on DVD and was broadcast in the United Kingdom. But American Fox audiences never got to see it on television. Think about what that means for a second. A completed, finished episode of a major television show, fully animated, voice-acted, scored, and ready to go, just sitting in a vault because the network decided it was too controversial to put on the air. And the show just continued without it, like it never happened. That's a remarkable situation that reveals just how much tension can exist between a creative team and the network that distributes their work. Here's one about the music. Family Guy is genuinely unusual among animated shows for the amount of original musical content it produces. The show has original songs in a significant number of episodes, and these aren't throwaway novelty tunes. Some of them are genuinely elaborate musical productions with multiple parts, harmonies, and real compositional craft behind them. Seth MacFarlane is himself a trained singer and musician, and that passion bleeds into the show in a very direct way. He's even released solo albums of classic American standards, which shows that his interest in music goes far beyond what he needs to do for the show. The Family Guy team has actually won Emmy Awards for outstanding music and lyrics on multiple occasions, which is not something that happens to shows that treat music as an afterthought. The musical numbers in Family Guy are taken seriously at every stage of production. Now, let's talk about something that connects to a much bigger cultural conversation. Family Guy has predicted or anticipated a number of real-world events in ways that are genuinely uncanny. This is something that gets shared around the internet fairly regularly, and while some of the supposed predictions are a stretch, there are a handful of genuine cases where episodes depicted situations that ended up reflecting real-life events that happened afterward. The show's writers have often addressed this by pointing out that when you produce enough content over enough years covering everything from politics to technology to culture, statistical probability alone means you're going to occasionally land on something that ends up happening in reality. But knowing the rational explanation doesn't make the moments feel any less strange when you encounter them. Let me give you a detail about the animation process that most people have never thought about. The show is written and voiced in Los Angeles, but the actual animation, the drawings, the movement, the visual comedy, is done by studios in South Korea. This is actually common practice for American animation, but the logistics are remarkable when you think about them. The American production team creates detailed storyboards and animatics that show exactly what needs to happen in every scene. These get sent overseas along with the audio recordings. The South Korean animators bring everything to life, and the finished animation gets sent back to Los Angeles for review and editing. The whole process requires incredibly precise communication across an enormous geographic distance and a significant time zone difference. When revisions need to be made, which happens regularly, the turnaround time has to be built into the production schedule in advance. It's a genuinely complex international collaboration that produces what looks on the surface like a relatively simple cartoon. Now, here's something about Seth MacFarlane's voice for Stewie that I find absolutely fascinating. The inspiration for Stewie's voice and character was rooted in a theatrical tradition. MacFarlane has cited Rex Harrison, the British stage and film actor famous for My Fair Lady, as a significant influence on how Stewie sounds. The slightly pompous, theatrically precise diction that defines Stewie's speech patterns comes from that tradition of a particular kind of mid-20th century British performance style. And when you know that, you start to hear it differently. Stewie isn't just a funny baby voice. He's a very specific cultural reference delivered through the character of an impossibly sophisticated infant. That layered quality, where there's a reference embedded inside a joke inside a character, is one of the things that separates Family Guy from simpler animated fare. Let's talk about the cast dynamic on the show, because there's something interesting happening there that goes beyond just who plays who. The main voice cast of Family Guy has been remarkably stable over the show's entire run. Seth MacFarlane, Alex Borstein, Seth Green, and Mila Kunis have all been constants, and there's a reason for that. When you have voice actors who have been playing the same characters for many years, they develop an intuitive understanding of how those characters think and speak. Seth Green, who voices Chris Griffin and also Meg in one memorable episode, has talked about how after so many years, he doesn't really have to think about how Chris sounds anymore. It's completely automatic. That kind of deep familiarity with a character produces performances that have a naturalness and consistency that you simply cannot get from new actors coming in cold. It's one of the reasons why long-running animated shows with stable casts tend to sound so cohesive. Here is something that will genuinely reframe how you think about the show's humor. A significant portion of the jokes in Family Guy are built around the assumption that you have a fairly broad base of cultural knowledge. References to old Hollywood films, classic literature, historical events, obscure musical acts, vintage television shows, and hundreds of other touchstones are woven throughout the comedy. This was a deliberate choice, and it creates an interesting layered effect where some jokes land for everyone, while other jokes only land for people who happen to share a particular reference point with the writers. When you get one of those deeper references, it feels like the show is specifically speaking to you, like the writers knew exactly who would be watching and crafted something just for that person. That feeling of being seen and understood is psychologically powerful, and it's one of the reasons why the show builds such passionate loyalty among its fans. Let me tell you about a moment in the show's history that caused a genuine wave of public reaction, unlike almost anything else Family Guy has ever done. In 2013, Family Guy aired an episode where it appeared that Brian Griffin, the family dog, was killed in a car accident and replaced with a new dog named Vinny. For a significant portion of the audience, this was devastating. Brian isn't just a side character. He's central to the emotional core of the show. He represents a certain kind of idealistic, intellectual aspiration that runs through the series. When he appeared to be gone permanently, fans were genuinely upset. There were petitions, there were articles. There was a genuine cultural conversation about the death of an animated dog. And then, a couple of episodes later, Stewie used his time machine to go back and save Brian, and everything returned to normal. Whether you view that as a clever narrative trick or as emotional manipulation, you cannot deny that it worked. The audience proved beyond any doubt just how much they cared about this character. Now, let me bring up something about the show's impact on the careers of the people involved in making it. Family Guy has served as a launching pad for a remarkable number of writers who went on to have significant careers of their own. The writing staff of Family Guy over the years has included people who went on to create or work on other major shows, films, and comedy projects. This is not unusual for a successful comedy series, but the density of talent that has passed through that writer's room is notable. In the entertainment industry, Family Guy has a reputation as a place where a certain kind of absurdist, fast-moving, pop-culture literate comedy is understood and valued, which makes it attractive to writers who share that sensibility and helps explain why the quality of certain types of jokes has remained consistent even as individual writers have come and gone. Here's something about the show's setting that most people take for granted without ever really thinking about it. Quahog, Rhode Island, is a fictional city, but it's based on a real place in a very specific way. Seth MacFarlane attended the Rhode Island School of Design, and his time in New England clearly influenced both the setting of the show and certain cultural textures that run through it. The accent that Peter Griffin uses is rooted in actual New England speech patterns, and there are recurring references to Boston, Rhode Island culture, and New England life throughout the series. The choice to set the show in a fictional Rhode Island city, rather than a generic American suburb, was deliberate, and it gives Quahog a specificity that makes it feel more real than if it were set somewhere completely generic. Now, here's a genuinely surprising piece of information about how long this show has actually been running. Family Guy has been on the air, counting the cancellation gap, for over 2 decades. Think about what that span of time actually means. Children who were born after the show first premiered have grown up, gone through school, and are now adults who themselves watch Family Guy. The show has outlasted entire television eras. Networks that competed with Fox in 1999 have changed dramatically. The landscape of media has been completely transformed by streaming services, social media, and a dozen other technological shifts. And through all of that, Peter Griffin is still tripping over the coffee table and hissing at his knee. There's something genuinely remarkable about that kind of longevity, especially for a show that was dead and buried for 3 years. Let me tell you something about the relationship between Family Guy and The Simpsons, because it's more complicated and interesting than most people realize. The Simpsons has been referenced in Family Guy, and the relationship between the two shows has been the subject of considerable commentary in both directions. There's a famous crossover episode that actually brought the two families together, which was a significant cultural moment for animation fans. But behind that crossover lies a longer history of tension, competition, and mutual acknowledgement between the two shows. The Simpsons purists have often been critical of Family Guy's style, arguing that the cutaway gags represent a lazier form of storytelling compared to The Simpsons' more narrative approach. Family Guy's creative team has generally been aware of and responsive to that criticism, sometimes directly addressing it within the show itself. The crossover episode, which aired in 2014, was a kind of détente between two animation giants, and the fact that it happened at all is remarkable given the complicated history between them. Here's something about the show's music that deserves more attention than it typically gets. The theme song for Family Guy, that instantly recognizable jingle that plays at the beginning of every episode, was composed by Seth MacFarlane himself, with lyrics by Walter Murphy. Walter Murphy is a fascinating figure in the show's history because he has served as the show's primary composer for its entire run, and his musical contributions go far beyond the theme. He has scored hundreds of episodes, created original songs, and helped establish the musical identity of the series. The fact that Family Guy has had this kind of musical consistency across its entire lifespan is unusual and has contributed significantly to the coherent feel of the show, even as other elements have evolved. Now, let me tell you something that will genuinely change how you watch the show going forward. There is a recurring background detail that extremely dedicated fans have noticed appearing throughout multiple episodes. Careful viewers who pay attention to things that are happening in the background of scenes, rather than just focusing on the main action, will occasionally catch small details and visual jokes that are never referenced or acknowledged by the characters. These hidden elements are part of a tradition in animation of rewarding attentive viewers with something extra. They're not crucial to understanding the episode. They're not announced or highlighted. They're just there for the people who are paying close enough attention to notice them. This kind of detail work reflects the care that goes into production, even in elements that most viewers will never consciously register. Here's one more thing I want to tell you about before we wrap up, because I think it perfectly captures what makes Family Guy a genuinely strange and fascinating cultural artifact. The show has always existed in a state of tension between two very different impulses. On one hand, it's a remarkably consistent piece of commercial entertainment that follows a reliable formula. You know roughly what you're going to get when you sit down to watch Family Guy. The characters are going to be recognizable, the jokes are going to follow certain patterns, and there's going to be a story that more or less resolves itself by the end. That consistency is part of what makes it comforting to watch. It's reliable in the way that comfort food is reliable. But on the other hand, Family Guy has repeatedly pushed into territory that no purely commercial entertainment product would go near. Controversial topics, deeply uncomfortable humor, storylines that deliberately challenge the audience's sympathies, episodes that break the fourth wall entirely and acknowledge their own status as a television show. These are the moves of a creative work that has genuine ambitions beyond just making you laugh for 22 minutes. The tension between those two impulses, the commercial and the genuinely experimental, is what gives Family Guy its distinctive energy. It's never fully one thing or the other. It's always both simultaneously, and that combination is genuinely unusual in the landscape of American television comedy. The show has won multiple Emmy Awards across various categories. It has generated spin-off series including The Cleveland Show and American Dad, which, while technically created by MacFarlane and his team as a separate project, shares DNA with Family Guy in obvious ways. The franchise that grew from that original short film Seth MacFarlane made in college has become one of the defining comedy properties in American television history. And yet, it almost didn't happen. It got canceled and brought back from the dead. It almost lost its creator to a tragedy. It had a voice actress leave before most people knew the show existed, and it had episodes locked away in vaults. It killed its most beloved character and then undid it. It made enemies and made cultural history simultaneously. Family Guy is a show that by every reasonable measure should not have survived as long as it has, produced as much content as it has, or remained as culturally relevant as it has. And yet here we are, more than 25 years after that first episode aired, and we're still talking about it, still watching it, still discovering new things about it. That's not an accident. That's the result of genuine creative passion, remarkable production dedication, an audience that cares deeply, and maybe just a little bit of luck along the way. So the next time you're watching Peter Griffin stumble through another adventure in Quahog, remember all of that. Remember the short film in a college dorm. Remember the flight that was missed. Remember the DVD sales that brought it back from the dead. Remember the voice actor doing 4 completely different characters in one room. Remember the 9 months of international production that went into those 22 minutes you're watching. There's a whole world behind that screen that most people never think about, and it's genuinely worth knowing about. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. If any of this surprised you or you want to share your own Family Guy facts that you think deserve more attention, drop them in the comments below. I read every single one, and sometimes the best stuff comes from the audience. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button because it genuinely helps this channel reach more people who love this kind of content. And if you want more deep dives into the shows, movies, and cultural moments that shaped who we are, subscribe right now because there is a lot more coming. I'll see you in the next one.
What if I told you that one cartoon dad has a higher body count than most movie villains? Today we're diving deep into the chaotic world of Peter Griffin and counting every single person this animated maniac has eliminated. Trust me, the numbers are absolutely insane. Most people think Peter Griffin is just a lovable goofball who makes stupid mistakes. But when you actually sit down and track his actions across hundreds of Family Guy episodes, a terrifying pattern emerges. This isn't just some clumsy dad bumbling through life. This is a walking disaster zone who leaves destruction wherever he goes. I spent weeks combing through every Family Guy episode, taking notes, rewinding scenes, and meticulously documenting each incident. What I discovered shocked me. Peter Griffin isn't just accidentally dangerous. He's legitimately one of the most prolific killers in television history. And the worst part? He never faces any real consequences. Let's start from the very beginning with Peter's first confirmed elimination. In only the second episode of the entire series, Peter runs down the Roadrunner from Looney Tunes while driving. Just flattens the poor bird completely. When asked if he hit something, Peter casually dismisses it and keeps driving. That casual attitude toward taking a life, it sets the tone for everything that follows. The very next episode, things escalate dramatically. A tour bus pulls up to the Griffin house, and Peter completely loses his mind. He grabs a shotgun and opens fire on the entire vehicle. 3 people eliminated just like that. His reaction to seeing strangers at his door was immediate violence. No questions asked. No attempt at communication. Just grab a weapon and start shooting. Then there's the hospital incident that really showcases Peter's dangerous incompetence. Somehow this man was allowed to work as a doctor, which should have been a red flag for everyone involved. During what appears to be a routine procedure, Peter's negligence directly leads to a patient's death. The fact that he was even permitted near medical equipment shows a serious breakdown in the system. But Peter's killing spree really picks up steam when he temporarily takes over Death's job. With supernatural powers at his disposal, Peter becomes exponentially more dangerous. He kills 2 airline pilots mid-flight simply by touching them. Thousands of passengers could have died if not for quick thinking from another character who managed to land the plane. Peter's reaction to nearly causing a massive aviation disaster? He jokes about needing mittens. The pattern becomes clear early on. Peter has zero regard for human life and even less understanding of consequences. When tasked with simple babysitting duties, he leaves an infant to drown in a bathtub. His parenting instincts are so fundamentally broken that he can't even keep a baby alive for one evening. Speaking of children, Peter's relationship with kids is consistently disturbing. When he briefly works as a nanny dressed up like Mary Poppins, 2 children end up dead and hidden under a bed. These weren't accidents or misunderstandings. Peter's presence in any childcare situation inevitably leads to tragedy. But the really chilling moments come when Peter turns his violence toward his own family. In one episode, his negligence with home repairs leads to carbon monoxide poisoning that kills Lois, Chris, and Meg. Even though they're miraculously fine in the next episode, Peter's actions directly cause their deaths. A husband and father who accidentally kills his entire family should be traumatized for life. Peter just moves on like nothing happened. The mob-style execution of Brian over some leftover food shows Peter's capacity for cold-blooded murder. When his dog eats his chicken and drinks his cream soda, Peter responds with gangster-level violence. The casual way he eliminates a family member over such trivial matters reveals the true depth of his sociopathic tendencies. Peter's parenting philosophy seems to involve extreme violence as conflict resolution. When his daughter faces bullying at school, instead of speaking to teachers or parents, Peter takes matters into his own hands. The bully doesn't survive the encounter. Later, when presenting what he thinks is the bully's head to his son, Peter admits he got the wrong kid entirely. He murdered an innocent deaf child by mistake and shows no remorse whatsoever. The axe murder of Cleveland represents a turning point where Peter's violence becomes increasingly graphic and disturbing. This isn't cartoon slapstick anymore. This is genuine horror movie material. The casual way Peter wields deadly weapons against friends and neighbors shows a complete break from reality and basic human decency. From this point forward, Peter's methods become increasingly brutal, and his body count starts climbing exponentially. The chainsaw massacres alone account for dozens of victims. Peter goes from house to house like a serial killer, methodically eliminating anyone in his path. The fact that he seems to enjoy this level of violence makes it even more disturbing. One of the most senseless killings involves Peter murdering a child just to steal a jet ski. When his family points out they're literally standing next to their boat, Peter ignores them and commits homicide anyway. This isn't about necessity or even twisted logic. This is pure evil masked as comedy. The restaurant incident where Peter kills a woman named Erica while trying to prove his cooking skills demonstrates how his ego and incompetence create deadly combinations. Peter's need to show off constantly puts innocent people in mortal danger. Peter's involvement in sports inevitably leads to casualties. Every athletic activity he participates in somehow results in someone's death. Whether it's shot put, treasure hunting, or any other recreational activity, Peter transforms harmless fun into lethal encounters. The drunk driving incidents reveal another layer of Peter's criminal behavior. He openly admits to calculating exactly how much alcohol he can consume while still being able to drive. This premeditated approach to endangering others shows Peter knows his actions are dangerous, but simply doesn't care about the consequences. The Boston Marathon Massacre stands out as one of Peter's most heinous acts. Running down dozens of innocent runners during a major sporting event crosses the line from accidental violence into mass murder territory. The casualty count from this single incident rivals actual terrorist attacks. Peter's racism leads to deadly encounters as well. His casual bigotry creates situations where innocent people lose their lives simply for existing in Peter's presence. The Anthropology store incident perfectly captures how Peter's prejudices fuel his violent tendencies. When Peter briefly becomes death incarnate, his kill count skyrockets through supernatural means. Having the literal power of life and death in Peter's hands is like giving a nuclear weapon to a toddler. The pilots who die simply from Peter's touch represent just the beginning of the carnage. The hospital bombings showcase Peter's evolution into full-scale terrorism. Destroying entire medical facilities because he disagrees with vaccines makes Peter an anti-science extremist willing to commit mass murder for his beliefs. The estimated casualty counts from these attacks reach into the hundreds. Peter's accidental involvement with actual terrorists leads to multiple explosive incidents. His friendship with a terrorist operative results in several bombings throughout the city. Even when Peter tries to do the right thing by helping authorities, he ends up triggering more explosions that kill dozens of innocent people. The secret society incident demonstrates Peter's capacity for large-scale destruction. Burning down an entire facility housing historical documents leads to hundreds of deaths. Peter's inability to consider consequences means every action he takes has the potential for massive collateral damage. The presidential fight with Donald Trump represents the peak of Peter's destructive potential. Their brawl triggers nuclear missile launches that devastate multiple population centers. The casualty count from this single incident reaches into the thousands. Peter literally causes acts of war through his inability to control his temper. But none of Peter's individual acts of violence compare to his ongoing feud with Ernie the Giant Chicken. This running conflict has resulted in more deaths and destruction than actual wars. Every encounter between these two characters leaves dozens of innocent bystanders dead. Their first major battle destroys multiple vehicles, causes plane crashes, and brings down entire buildings. The Ferry wheel incident alone accounts for hundreds of casualties, as the massive structure rolls through populated areas. Their fights aren't contained conflicts between two individuals. They're citywide disasters that claim enormous numbers of innocent lives. The cruise ship battle represents the most destructive single incident in their ongoing war. When their fight moves into the engine room, they lose control of a massive passenger vessel that crashes into a major city. The resulting destruction levels multiple city blocks and kills hundreds of people. This single incident qualifies as one of the worst maritime disasters in history. Their time travel battle creates paradoxes that threaten the fabric of reality itself. When Peter and Ernie use time manipulation technology to continue their fight across multiple historical periods, they create cascading effects that alter the course of human history. The scientist who created the time machine becomes an early casualty of their temporal warfare. The NASA facility destruction shows how their conflict has escalated beyond Earth itself. Their space battle crashes back to the planet and destroys an ocean oil rig, adding environmental disaster to their already impressive list of crimes against humanity. The reverse time sequence battle creates some of the most confusing and deadly encounters in their entire conflict. When everything starts happening backwards, the destruction becomes even more widespread and incomprehensible. Plane crashes, building collapses, and mass casualties all blend together in a chaotic symphony of violence. When you calculate the total casualties from just the Peter versus Ernie conflicts, the number reaches nearly 1,500 deaths. This means half of Peter's entire body count comes from a single ongoing dispute that started over an expired coupon. The fact that such trivial origins led to such massive destruction perfectly encapsulates Peter's character. The crossover episode with The Simpsons showcases Peter's ability to bring his destructive tendencies to other fictional universes. His fight with Homer Simpson levels significant portions of Springfield and adds another 100 casualties to his count. Even when visiting other shows, Peter cannot help but create mayhem and death. Throughout all of these incidents, certain patterns emerge that make Peter's behavior even more disturbing. He shows no remorse for any of his actions. He never learns from his mistakes or attempts to modify his behavior. Most importantly, he faces no meaningful consequences for any of his crimes. The legal system in Peter's universe seems completely incapable of holding him accountable. Despite committing mass murder on multiple occasions, Peter continues to walk free and repeat his destructive patterns. This creates a world where violence has no consequences and human life has no value. Peter's family and friends enable his behavior by treating his mass murder sprees as minor inconveniences rather than serious crimes. When someone consistently kills innocent people, the appropriate response is not to laugh it off and wait for the next episode. The normalization of Peter's violence makes everyone around him complicit in his crimes. The media within Peter's world also fails to adequately report on his actions. Despite causing multiple disasters that should dominate news cycles for months, Peter's crimes are quickly forgotten and life returns to normal. This unrealistic portrayal of consequences sends dangerous messages about accountability and justice. When you add up every death directly attributable to Peter Griffin's actions, the final count reaches approximately 2,800 people. This makes him one of the most prolific killers in entertainment history. For context, this body count exceeds many actual historical mass murderers and rivals casualty figures from major military conflicts. The fact that this level of violence is presented as comedy raises serious questions about desensitization to violence in media. When mass murder becomes a punchline, society loses important moral boundaries that separate acceptable behavior from criminal acts. Peter Griffin represents the logical extreme of consequence-free violence in entertainment. His character demonstrates what happens when someone with destructive tendencies faces no accountability for their actions. The result is escalating violence that eventually reaches genocidal proportions. The most disturbing aspect of Peter's character is how his violence is often portrayed as justified or at least understandable. Whether defending his family, pursuing his goals, or simply satisfying his curiosity, Peter's murderous actions are presented within contexts that make them seem reasonable to viewers. This normalization of extreme violence has real-world implications for how audiences process and respond to actual violence in their daily lives. When fictional characters commit mass murder without consequences, it becomes easier to dismiss real violence as less serious than it actually is. The Peter Griffin phenomenon also reveals how comedy can be used to mask serious social problems. By presenting his violent tendencies as humorous character quirks, rather than serious mental health issues, the show avoids confronting the deeper implications of his behavior. In conclusion, Peter Griffin's body count of 2,800 people makes him one of the deadliest characters in television history. His casual approach to mass murder, combined with the complete lack of consequences he faces, creates a character who embodies the worst aspects of unchecked violence and social irresponsibility. While Family Guy presents his actions as comedy, the sheer scale of death and destruction he causes reveals a character who belongs in prison rather than primetime television. What's up, everyone, and welcome back to the channel where we dive deep into the most dysfunctional family on television. Today we're talking about something that's been bothering me for years watching Family Guy. Peter Griffin might be an absolute disaster of a human being, but honestly, his wife Lois has pulled some stunts that would make any reasonable person run straight to a divorce lawyer. I'm talking about moments so outrageous, so completely unforgivable, that you'll be questioning how this marriage even survived. We're counting down the 5 most shocking times Peter should have packed his bags and never looked back. Trust me when I say number 1 is going to blow your mind because it involves a certain pop star and some seriously questionable decisions. But before we jump in, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell because we've got tons more Family Guy content coming your way. Let's kick things off with number 5. And honestly, this one still makes me uncomfortable just thinking about it. Picture this. Lois Griffin, the supposedly devoted wife and mother, decides to have an affair with none other than former President Bill Clinton. Yeah, you heard that right. The President of the United States. Now, I know Family Guy is known for its outrageous storylines, but this one crosses every possible line you can imagine. The whole mess starts when Clinton rolls into Quahog for what's supposed to be an innocent beauty contest judging gig. His presidential limo conveniently breaks down right in front of the Griffin house, and suddenly Peter finds himself starstruck by his new famous friend. At first, it seems harmless enough, just 2 guys hanging out causing minor mischief around town. But then Lois discovers Peter looking absolutely terrible the next morning, and she is not having it, especially when she finds out he brought home a random pig from their adventures. Now, here's where any normal person would just have a conversation with their pig spouse about boundaries and responsibility. But Lois Griffin is not normal people. Instead of talking to Peter directly, she marches herself over to Clinton's hotel room to give the former president a piece of her mind about corrupting her husband. Big mistake. And I mean astronomically huge mistake. Because the next thing you know, she's completely fallen for Clinton's legendary charm. The situation goes from bad to absolutely catastrophic when Peter walks in to find his wife in bed with the president. Can you even imagine that moment? The betrayal, the shock, the complete destruction of everything you thought you knew about your marriage. Peter literally catches them in the act, and Lois has the audacity to come crawling back, begging for forgiveness like this is just some minor marital hiccup. But here's the part that really gets me. Instead of demanding answers or showing any kind of backbone, Peter just accepts her pathetic excuse and even agrees to her twisted proposal that he can sleep with anyone he wants to get even. The whole situation is so messed up that even when Peter chooses to get revenge with Lois's own mother, the moral compass of this family is just completely broken. What makes this even worse is that this isn't just about physical betrayal, it's about the complete lack of respect Lois shows for her marriage and family. She throws away decades of marriage for a quick fling with a politician and somehow expects everything to just go back to normal. Any self-respecting person would have walked away right then and there, but not Peter Griffin. Moving on to number 4, and this one might actually be worse, because it involves someone who should be completely off limits. Meg's teenage boyfriend, Anthony. Now, I know what you're thinking. Meg actually managed to get a boyfriend. That's shocking enough on its own, but what Lois does next is absolutely unforgivable and frankly pretty disturbing. Anthony seems like a decent kid, probably the first normal person to show any interest in Meg, ever. Peter and Lois are initially thrilled that their daughter finally found someone. But then Anthony makes one innocent compliment about Lois looking like a movie star, and suddenly she's acting like a predator stalking her prey. The whole thing starts innocently enough with Lois just feeling flattered by the attention, but then she completely loses her mind and starts fantasizing about this underage kid. We're talking about a grown woman in her 40s getting worked up over a teenage boy who's dating her own daughter. The levels of wrong here are just astronomical, and it gets so much worse. Lois doesn't just fantasize, she takes action. She literally creates a schedule showing when Peter will be out of the house and when she'll be available. She hands this to a minor, along with details about her personal life that no teenager should ever know about. The predatory behavior is so blatant and disturbing that it's honestly hard to watch. When she finally makes her move and tries to seduce Anthony, the kid is surprisingly into it, which somehow makes the whole situation even more disturbing. But of course, Meg walks in at the worst possible moment and catches her own mother trying to hook up with her boyfriend. The emotional damage this causes to Meg is something that family will probably never recover from. The worst part about this whole scenario is how Lois handles getting caught. Instead of taking responsibility for her completely inappropriate behavior, she manipulates the situation to make herself the victim. She tells Peter that he makes her feel old and ugly, essentially blaming him for her decision to prey on a teenager. And Peter, being the spineless disaster that he is, actually apologizes to her, and the whole thing gets swept under the rug like nothing happened. This right here should have been the end of their marriage. There's no coming back from trying to sleep with your daughter's underage boyfriend. The betrayal of trust. The emotional damage to Meg. The complete breakdown of appropriate boundaries. It's all unforgivable. But somehow Peter just lets it slide, and life goes on as normal in the Griffin household. Coming in at number 3, we have the time Lois discovered gambling and literally bet away the family car at a casino. This one starts innocently enough, with the family taking a road trip to help Chris with his Boy Scout troubles. Peter, being Peter, refuses to ask for directions, even when they're clearly lost, and the situation gets worse when he needs to make an emergency bathroom stop at a Native American casino. While Peter handles his business, Lois finds herself with some free time, and that's when she spots the poker machines. Now, for most people, this would be a harmless distraction, maybe lose a few dollars and move on with your day. But Lois Griffin has zero impulse control, and within minutes, she's completely hooked on gambling. The addiction happens so fast, it's actually frightening to watch. One minute she's just curious about the flashing lights and sounds, the next minute she's feeding money into these machines like her life depends on it. Peter literally has to drag her away from the gambling floor when it's time to leave, but the damage is already done. Lois has caught the gambling bug, and it's about to destroy everything. Here's where the story goes from concerning to absolutely insane. While Peter is distracted, Lois manages to lose the family car in a poker game. She literally gambles away their primary means of transportation, stranding the entire family at a casino in the middle of nowhere. The level of irresponsibility and selfishness it takes to make that kind of decision is just staggering. Peter ends up having to pretend to be Native American and spend a night hungry in the forest just to win back their car through some ridiculous tribal challenge. The fact that he actually pulls this off is a miracle, but that doesn't excuse what Lois did. She put her entire family at risk because she couldn't control herself around some flashing lights and the sound of coins dropping. The gambling addiction reveals something really dark about Lois's character. She's willing to sacrifice her family's security and well-being for the temporary thrill of potentially winning money. This isn't just a momentary lapse in judgment. It's a fundamental character flaw that shows she can't be trusted with important decisions. Any reasonable person would have serious doubts about continuing a marriage with someone who would gamble away the family car on a whim. What makes this even more frustrating is that there are no real consequences for Lois's actions. Peter saves the day, gets the car back, and they all go home like nothing happened. There's no discussion about gambling addiction, no acknowledgement of how her behavior could have left them stranded, no recognition that this kind of impulse control problem might be a serious issue in their marriage. Now we're getting to the really disturbing stuff, with number 2, where Lois reads one book about minimalism and completely loses her mind in the most destructive way possible. This episode perfectly captures how Lois tends to take any new idea and push it to absolutely insane extremes without any regard for how it affects her family. The whole disaster starts when Lois discovers a book about decluttering and minimalism. The basic concept is pretty reasonable. Getting rid of unnecessary stuff to focus on what truly brings you joy. Most people would maybe clean out a closet or donate some old clothes, but not Lois Griffin. She decides that minimalism means literally throwing away everything and everyone in her life that doesn't spark immediate happiness. The author of this minimalism book claims to have learned these revolutionary insights by meditating on a bridge in Asia, which should have been a red flag, that this isn't exactly scientific advice. But Lois is so desperate to find meaning in her life that she latches onto this philosophy like it's going to solve all her problems. What starts as organizing and decluttering quickly escalates to Lois throwing away family belongings without permission. She's making unilateral decisions about what brings the family joy, completely ignoring everyone else's feelings and attachments to their possessions. The lack of consideration for her family's feelings and the authoritarian way she starts controlling everyone's lives is just incredibly toxic. But then Lois takes it to the ultimate extreme and decides that her own family doesn't bring her enough joy, so she kicks them out of the house. Peter, Chris, Meg, Brian, and Stewie all end up living in a storage unit while Lois enjoys her empty minimalist paradise. Can you imagine throwing your own children out of their home because a self-help book told you to focus on joy? This is abandonment of the highest order. The situation gets even more surreal when Lois decides that she herself is clutter and needs to be thrown away. She literally abandons her family completely, leaving behind only a vague note before disappearing entirely. Her husband and children have no idea where she is or if she's even alive. This level of selfish behavior goes way beyond any normal marital problems. It takes Lois falling into an actual garbage barge and nearly drowning in trash for her to realize that maybe throwing away your entire family wasn't the brilliant idea she thought it was. She comes back home babbling about how garbage is wonderful and everything is garbage, which doesn't exactly inspire confidence that she's learned anything meaningful from this experience. The fact that Peter just welcomes her back after she abandoned the entire family shows an incredible lack of self-respect. Lois literally threw away her marriage and her children because a book told her to focus on joy, and somehow that's just something they all moved past, like it was a minor disagreement about dinner plans. Finally, we reach number 1, and this is the most disturbing example of all. Lois has a midlife crisis meltdown and ends up trying to seduce Justin Bieber, who at the time was clearly underage. This isn't just inappropriate behavior, this is straight up predatory and potentially criminal activity. The whole nightmare begins when Lois is feeling down about getting older, and Peter makes everything worse by reading her a birthday poem that basically lists all the ways she's aged and become less attractive. Now granted, Peter's poem is incredibly insensitive and hurtful, but that doesn't justify what Lois does next. Instead of having an adult conversation about feeling unappreciated, or seeking therapy, or literally any other healthy coping mechanism, Lois decides to have a complete psychological breakdown. She starts dressing like a teenager and acting like she's in high school again, which is already embarrassing enough for a middle-aged mother. But then, things take a turn into seriously illegal territory when Justin Bieber comes to town, and Lois becomes obsessed with meeting him. She shows up at his concert acting like a screaming teenage fan, which is cringe-worthy enough when you're watching a grown woman embarrass herself on live television while her family watches in horror. The situation reaches peak disturbing when Lois actually tracks down Bieber's dressing room and tries to seduce him. She bribes a security guard, gets into his private area, and starts making advances on someone who is clearly a minor. The power dynamic here is incredibly disturbing, an adult woman using her age and experience to manipulate a teenage celebrity. When she tells this underage kid to take his pants off, that's when this crosses the line from inappropriate into potentially criminal behavior. This isn't just a midlife crisis. This is predatory behavior that would absolutely result in criminal charges if this happened in real life. The fact that Peter shows up just in time to stop anything from happening doesn't excuse what Lois was attempting to do. What makes this even more infuriating is how the episode handles the aftermath. Peter and Lois have a heart-to-heart conversation where they both admit to having insecurities, and suddenly everything is forgiven. There's no acknowledgement that Lois literally tried to commit a felony or that her behavior was completely unacceptable under any circumstances. This pattern of behavior throughout all these episodes shows that Lois Griffin is fundamentally selfish, manipulative, and completely unable to take responsibility for her actions. Whether she's cheating with presidents, gambling away family property, abandoning her children, or attempting to seduce minors, she always finds a way to make herself the victim and avoid any real consequences. Peter Griffin might be an idiot, but he deserves better than a wife who consistently betrays their marriage vows, endangers their family, and commits potentially criminal acts whenever she feels a little bit unhappy with her life. Any of these incidents individually would be grounds for divorce, but all of them together paint a picture of someone who is completely unfit to be a wife and mother. The most frustrating part is that Family Guy treats all of this like it's just harmless comedy, when in reality, these behaviors would destroy any real family. Lois Griffin represents the worst possible partner, someone who takes no responsibility, lies, manipulates, and puts her own selfish desires above the safety and well-being of her family. So there you have it, folks. 5 times when Peter Griffin should have absolutely divorced Lois and never looked back. From presidential affairs to attempted felonies, this woman has done things that would end any normal marriage immediately. Let me know in the comments which one of these shocked you the most, and whether you think there are any other Lois moments that deserve to be on this list. Don't forget to smash that like button if you enjoyed this deep dive into the Griffin family dysfunction, and subscribe for more Family Guy content. We've got tons more episodes to break down, and trust me, there's no shortage of material when it comes to this completely insane cartoon family. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Hey there, Night Owls and Family Guy fanatics. Before you drift off to dreamland, let me take you on a journey through the twisted world of Quahog and its unforgettable residents. Tonight we're diving deep into the most beloved and despised characters from Seth MacFarlane's animated masterpiece. So grab your favorite pillow, get comfortable, and let's explore the wild personalities that have kept us laughing and cringing for over 2 decades. Picture this: a small Rhode Island town where a talking baby plots world domination. A paralyzed cop remains the voice of reason, and a dog walks upright while nursing his literary pretensions. This is the bizarre universe of Family Guy, where moral compasses spin wildly and character development takes unexpected turns. Some residents of Quahog have captured our hearts with their quirky charm, while others have become the targets of fan frustration and outright hatred. What makes a Family Guy character lovable versus loathsome? Is it their moral fiber, their comedic timing, or simply how much chaos they create? As we journey through this character analysis, you'll discover why certain personalities have endured as fan favorites, while others have fallen from grace, becoming symbols of everything wrong with the show's direction. Let's begin our exploration with Joe Swanson, a character who stands out like a beacon of decency in an ocean of dysfunction. In a show filled with morally questionable individuals, Joe represents something genuinely admirable. Despite being confined to a wheelchair, he never allows his disability to define his worth or limit his capabilities as a police officer. His determination and positive attitude shine through even in the darkest episodes. What makes Joe so endearing is his refusal to play the victim. Instead of wallowing in self-pity, he embraces his condition with humor and grace. The self-deprecating jokes about his wheelchair become running gags that work precisely because Joe himself doesn't view his disability as a weakness. He's shown time and again that physical limitations cannot diminish his strength, courage, or effectiveness as both an officer and a friend. Remember that powerful episode where Joe temporarily regained the use of his legs? The transformation was startling. Power corrupted him almost instantly, turning our beloved reasonable Joe into an insufferable, cocky version of himself. It took his friends literally breaking his legs again to restore the Joe we knew and loved. This storyline brilliantly demonstrated that Joe's wheelchair wasn't a limitation, but rather an integral part of what made him special. Joe's genuine kindness shines through in his interactions with others, particularly in how he handles Meg's crush on him. Rather than humiliating her or making the situation awkward, he lets her down gently, showing the consideration and maturity that separates him from his less evolved friends. His relationship with Bonnie may have its challenges, but Joe consistently approaches their problems with patience and understanding. The contrast becomes stark when we examine Chris Griffin, who represents the opposite end of the likability spectrum. Chris has undergone one of the most disappointing character transformations in the series. What began as an awkward but relatably sweet teenager has devolved into something far more disturbing. His evolution from lovable oddball to creepy, perverted dunce has left many fans wondering what happened to the Chris they once enjoyed. Early Chris possessed an innocent goofiness that made his mistakes forgivable. He was weird, sure, but in an endearing way that reminded viewers of their own awkward teenage years. However, as seasons progressed, the writers seemed to drain all charm from his character, replacing it with increasingly disturbing behavior patterns that mirror his father's worst traits without any of the redeeming humor. The breaking point for many fans came during this episode where Chris's response to bullying involved kidnapping Stewie and locking him in a backpack. This wasn't just stupid or misguided. It revealed a genuinely sociopathic streak that made him irredeemably unlikable. His willingness to exploit and harm others for personal gain became a recurring theme that alienated viewers who had once rooted for him. Chris's artistic talents offered glimpses of potential depth, but the writers consistently chose to ignore these opportunities in favor of cheap, gross-out humor. Instead of developing his creative side, they reduced him to a walking masturbation joke, with no growth, no development, and no apparent purpose beyond making audiences uncomfortable. On the complete opposite end of the spectrum, we find Adam West, the delightfully unhinged mayor of Quahog. West represents everything wonderful about Family Guy's absurdist humor. His complete disconnection from reality, combined with his earnest delivery of utterly ridiculous statements, creates comedy gold that never feels forced or artificial. What makes Mayor West so beloved is his authentic insanity. Unlike other characters whose crazy behavior feels calculated or mean-spirited, West's lunacy comes from a place of genuine confusion about how the world works. His attempts to gain superpowers by visiting toxic waste dumps or his confusion about basic concepts like public transportation create moments of pure comedic brilliance. The beauty of Adam West lies in his unpredictability. You never know what bizarre tangent his mind will take next, but you can be certain it will be hilarious. His complete lack of self-awareness, combined with his position of authority, creates endless opportunities for absurd situations that showcase the show's willingness to embrace complete nonsense in service of comedy. West's corruption stems not from malice or greed, but from his fundamental inability to understand basic concepts. This makes him simultaneously dangerous and endearing, a combination that few characters can pull off successfully. His random policy decisions and bizarre public appearances never fail to entertain, making him a consistent bright spot in the series. Bonnie Swanson presents a more complex case study in character likability. While Joe represents the best of humanity despite his physical challenges, Bonnie embodies frustration and resentment that many viewers find insufferable. Her constant complaints about her marriage feel particularly grating given her apparent unwillingness to actually address her supposed problems. Bonnie's role as the perpetual martyr becomes tiresome quickly. She acts as though caring for Joe is some unbearable burden, despite the fact that their relationship appears mutually beneficial. Her dependency on him contradicts her complaints about him, creating a character who seems more interested in generating sympathy than actually improving her situation. Her parenting, or lack thereof, presents another source of frustration. Bonnie shows minimal interest in her children, appearing detached and disengaged from their lives. This emotional distance, combined with her holier-than-thou attitude, creates a character who feels hypocritical and unlikable. Her affair with Brian further emphasizes her lack of respect for Joe, despite his obvious devotion to their family. The contrast between Bonnie and Joe highlights why Joe remains beloved, while Bonnie generates irritation. Joe faces genuine challenges with grace and humor, while Bonnie creates drama from relatively minor inconveniences. Her constant negativity and victim mentality make her one of the show's least sympathetic characters. Meg Griffin occupies a unique position in the Family Guy universe as the ultimate underdog. Her status as the family scapegoat has created an interesting dynamic where her suffering becomes a source of both comedy and sympathy. Many fans find themselves rooting for Meg precisely because she endures so much abuse from those around her. What makes Meg's character work is the exaggerated nature of her mistreatment. The abuse is so over-the-top and ridiculous that it loops back into comedy territory. Her family's treatment of her is so absurdly unfair that it becomes funny rather than genuinely disturbing. This delicate balance allows viewers to laugh at her situation while still feeling sympathy for her plight. Meg's occasional moments of strength and rebellion provide satisfying payoffs for viewers who have watched her suffer. When she finally stands up to her family or demonstrates hidden talents, these scenes feel earned and gratifying. Her brief stint in prison, where she became tough and confident, showed glimpses of what she could be if freed from her family's oppression. The character's potential remains largely untapped, which adds to her appeal. Meg possesses intelligence, artistic ability, and hidden depths that rarely get explored. This untapped potential makes her feel more human and relatable than many of her more cartoonish family members. Her moments of genuine emotion and vulnerability create connections with viewers who see themselves in her struggles. Doug represents everything wrong with Family Guy's approach to rivalry characters. Introduced as Stewie's nemesis, Doug never lived up to his intended role as a worthy adversary. Instead, he became a repetitive annoyance that frustrated both Stewie and the audience. His upper-class smugness and apparent invincibility made him feel like a cheap plot device rather than a genuine character. The fundamental problem with Doug was his lack of interesting qualities. He wasn't clever enough to match Stewie intellectually, funny enough to be entertaining, or threatening enough to feel dangerous. He was simply there, taking up screen time that could have been better used developing existing characters or introducing more compelling new ones. Stewie's inability to defeat Doug felt wrong for his character. The genius baby who builds time machines and death rays should not be consistently outsmarted by a slightly privileged toddler. This dynamic undermined Stewie's established competence and made their conflicts feel artificial and frustrating. The writer's decision to unceremoniously kill Doug off-screen felt like an admission of failure. Rather than providing closure to his storylines or giving him a memorable exit, they simply erased him from the show, leaving viewers with no payoff for the time they had invested in his conflicts with Stewie. Carter Pewterschmidt succeeds where Doug fails by embracing his role as an entertaining antagonist. As Lois's father and Peter's nemesis, Carter embodies every negative stereotype about wealthy elites while remaining genuinely funny. His complete disconnection from normal life, combined with his ruthless business practices, creates a character who is simultaneously despicable and hilarious. Carter's disdain for Peter provides some of the show's best ongoing comedy. His barely concealed contempt for his son-in-law, combined with his obvious belief that Lois deserves better, creates tension that translates into laughs. The fact that he's not entirely wrong about Peter's shortcomings adds depth to their antagonistic relationship. What makes Carter entertaining, rather than annoying, is his honesty about his awfulness. He never pretends to be a good person or tries to justify his selfish behavior. His brutal honesty about his motivations and his complete lack of self-awareness create comedy that feels authentic to his character. He knows exactly what he likes and uses his wealth to get it. Consequences be damned. Carter's capitalism, taken to absurd extremes, provides commentary on wealth inequality while remaining funny. His casual dismissal of poor people's problems and his genuine confusion about how normal people live create moments that are both satirical and comedic. He represents everything wrong with the ultra-wealthy, while being entertaining enough that viewers enjoy watching him. Herbert the Pervert represents one of Family Guy's most controversial characters. While some viewers find his antics mildly amusing, many fans consider him genuinely disturbing rather than funny. His entire character revolves around inappropriate behavior toward children, which crosses lines that many viewers find uncomfortable. The problem with Herbert lies in his one-note nature. Unlike other problematic characters who possess redeeming qualities or interesting depths, Herbert exists solely to make inappropriate jokes about children. This limited scope makes him feel more like a running gag that has overstayed its welcome rather than a fully developed character. Herbert's voice and mannerisms, while distinctive, quickly become grating rather than endearing. His appearances often feel forced, as though the writers are including him simply because he exists rather than because he serves any narrative purpose. This makes his scenes feel like interruptions rather than integral parts of episodes. The character's uncomfortable implications make many viewers question whether his inclusion is worth the potential laughs. While Family Guy has always pushed boundaries, Herbert's particular brand of humor feels more creepy than clever, leading many fans to wish he would simply disappear from the show entirely. Quagmire presents one of the most complex cases in Family Guy character analysis. His status as a perverted neighbor should make him completely unlikable, yet he maintains a dedicated fan base who appreciate his role in the show's dynamic. His relationships with women are deeply problematic, but his character possesses enough depth and humor to keep many viewers entertained. What saves Quagmire from complete condemnation is his occasional display of genuine care and loyalty. His protection of his sister Brenda and his willingness to stand up to her abusive boyfriend showed a side of him that transcended his usual selfish behavior. These moments of heroism provide glimpses of decency beneath his problematic exterior. Quagmire's rivalry with Brian offers some of the series' most memorable confrontations. His brutal takedown of Brian's hypocrisy during their dinner argument became an instant classic moment that many fans still quote. His ability to see through Brian's pretentious facade and call him out directly resonated with viewers who had grown tired of Brian's self-righteousness. The character's backstory adds layers that make him more than just a one-dimensional pervert. His complicated relationship with his father Ida and his genuine care for his cats reveal aspects of his personality that contradict his surface-level characterization. These contradictions make him feel more human and complex than many other characters. Brian Griffin represents perhaps the most dramatic fall from grace in Family Guy history. Once beloved as the voice of reason and moral center of the Griffin family, Brian has transformed into one of the show's most insufferable characters. His evolution from lovable family pet to pretentious hypocrite has alienated many longtime fans. Early Brian possessed integrity and intelligence that made him a compelling character. His refusal to cheat on exams and his genuine concern for his family's well-being established him as someone worth rooting for. However, as seasons progressed, his worst traits became more pronounced, while his positive qualities faded into memory. Brian's literary pretensions have become a source of endless frustration for viewers. His constant references to his unfinished novel and his pseudo-intellectual posturing feel tired and repetitive. His tendency to break up with women for being smarter than him reveals the shallow nature of his supposed intellectualism. The character's selfishness has reached levels that make him genuinely unlikable. His refusal to wear a flea collar despite infesting his entire family, his exploitation of Stewie's kindness, and his terrible treatment of his son Dylan paint a picture of someone who cares only about himself. His death and subsequent resurrection felt like missed opportunities to either give him meaningful character growth or replace him permanently. Brian's romantic relationships showcase his hypocrisy most clearly. He complains about only dating unintelligent women while actively seeking out such relationships. His inability to maintain connections with educated, accomplished women reveals his own insecurities and shallow nature. His treatment of women ranges from dismissive to actively harmful. Stewie Griffin stands as Family Guy's greatest character success story. His evolution from one-dimensional evil baby to complex, witty, and emotionally engaging character represents the best of what the show can achieve when it focuses on character development. His journey from would-be world conqueror to beloved family member has been genuinely compelling to watch. What makes Stewie so endearing is his combination of childish wonder and adult sophistication. His advanced vocabulary and complex schemes contrast beautifully with his genuine need for love and acceptance. This duality creates comedy that feels both intelligent and heartfelt, a rare combination in the Family Guy universe. Stewie's relationship with Brian, despite Brian's recent character deterioration, has provided some of the series' most memorable and touching moments. Their adventures together showcase both characters at their best, with Stewie's loyalty and Brian's companionship creating genuine emotional connections. Stewie's efforts to save Brian's life demonstrated the depth of their bond. The character's growth from villain to anti-hero to beloved family member has felt natural and earned. His evil schemes have become more playful than threatening, while his capacity for kindness and loyalty has expanded. His interactions with Rupert reveal his childlike side, while his inventions showcase his genius-level intellect. Stewie's humor has evolved to become more sophisticated and character-driven, rather than relying solely on shock value. His sarcastic observations and witty comebacks feel authentic to his personality while providing consistent laughs. His ability to break the fourth wall and comment on the show itself adds meta-humor that longtime fans appreciate. Lois Griffin presents a fascinating case study in character likability, or rather, the lack thereof. While she appears to be the moral center of the Griffin family, closer examination reveals her to be just as flawed and problematic as the relatives she criticizes. Her hypocrisy and manipulative behavior have made her increasingly unpopular with fans over time. Lois's biggest problem is her tendency to present herself as morally superior while engaging in behavior that contradicts her stated values. She criticizes others for infidelity while having multiple affairs. Herself, she plays the concerned mother while neglecting her children's actual needs. This disconnect between her self-image and her actions creates a character who feels dishonest and frustrating. Her treatment of Meg represents some of her worst behavior. While Peter's abuse of Meg is overt and cartoonish, Lois's neglect and emotional manipulation feel more realistic and therefore more disturbing. Her tendency to gaslight Meg and play the victim when confronted about her parenting failures reveals a calculating side to her personality. Lois's violent tendencies, particularly after learning martial arts, showcase her capacity for genuine cruelty. Her attacks on innocent people and her aggressive behavior toward service workers reveal someone with serious anger management issues. The fact that she blames Peter for her violent outbursts demonstrates her unwillingness to take responsibility for her own actions. Her relationship with Peter, while central to the show, often feels more like mutual exploitation than genuine love. Both characters use each other for their own purposes, with Lois frequently manipulating Peter's stupidity to get her way. This dynamic makes their marriage feel hollow and transactional, rather than romantic or meaningful. Dr. Hartman provides comic relief through his spectacular medical incompetence. His complete cluelessness about basic medical procedures creates absurd situations that highlight the show's willingness to embrace complete nonsense for comedic effect. His survival in his profession defies all logic, which makes him perfect for Family Guy's reality. What makes Dr. Hartman endearing despite his obvious malpractice is his earnest delivery of completely wrong information. He never seems aware of his incompetence, approaching each medical crisis with unwarranted confidence. This combination of ignorance and enthusiasm creates comedy that feels lighthearted rather than mean-spirited. His interactions with patients and their families provide opportunities for misunderstandings that showcase the show's love of absurdist humor. His tendency to deliver completely irrelevant information with the same seriousness as actual medical advice creates confusion that translates into laughs. Dr. Hartman's continued employment at Quahog Hospital raises questions about the town's medical oversight, but viewers have learned to embrace such logical inconsistencies as part of Family Guy's charm. His presence provides reliable comedy without requiring complex character development or emotional investment. Peter Griffin occupies the uncomfortable position of being both the show's protagonist and arguably its most hateable character. His journey from lovable oaf to genuinely problematic individual has paralleled many fans' growing frustration with the series' direction. His behavior has become increasingly cruel and selfish, making him difficult to root for or even tolerate. Peter's treatment of his family represents his worst qualities. His abuse of Meg goes far beyond typical sibling rivalry or parental discipline, crossing into territory that feels genuinely disturbing. His physical violence toward his children and wife, while played for laughs, creates uncomfortable viewing for many fans. His friendship with Joe, Cleveland, and Quagmire often brings out his most selfish instincts. His encouragement of Joe's infidelity and his general disregard for his friend's well-being shows someone who views relationships as sources of entertainment rather than genuine connections. His inability to support others during difficult times reveals his fundamental self-centeredness. Peter's lack of growth or learning represents one of the show's biggest weaknesses. Despite facing consequences for his actions, he never develops genuine understanding or changes his behavior patterns. This static character development makes him feel less like a person and more like a collection of negative traits, designed to drive plot points. His role as father figure is particularly problematic, as his children are forced to navigate their development despite, rather than because, of his influence. His failure to provide guidance, support, or even basic safety for his family makes him one of television's worst fictional parents. The evolution of these characters reflects Family Guy's own journey as a series. Early seasons balanced outrageous humor with genuine character moments that made viewers care about these flawed individuals. As time progressed, the show's emphasis shifted toward shock value and repetitive gags at the expense of character development. Some characters, like Stewie and Joe, have maintained their appeal through consistent characterization and occasional growth. Others, like Brian and Chris, have suffered from writers who seemed more interested in exploiting their worst traits than exploring their potential for development. Still, others, like Peter and Lois, have become Annie-Edie, increasingly unlikable as their negative qualities have been amplified without corresponding positive growth. The most beloved Family Guy characters tend to possess self-awareness about their flaws or demonstrate genuine care for others despite their problems. Joe's kindness, Stewie's loyalty, and even Carter's honesty about his selfishness make them more palatable than characters who lack these redeeming qualities. Conversely, the most hated characters often combine terrible behavior with hypocrisy or complete lack of self-reflection. Brian's pretentiousness, Lois's manipulation, and Peter's cruelty become harder to tolerate when the characters themselves seem unaware of or indifferent to their impact on others. The show's treatment of these characters also influences fan perception. Characters who face consequences for their actions or show occasional vulnerability tend to maintain viewer sympathy longer than those who seem invulnerable to the effects of their behavior. The parenter. Writers' willingness to explore character depths versus relying on surface-level gags often determines whether characters remain fresh or become stale. Family Guy's character dynamics work best when they balance outrageous behavior with moments of genuine humanity. The show's finest episodes often feature characters stepping outside their established roles to reveal hidden depths or unexpected kindness. These moments remind viewers why they became invested in these characters originally. As you settle into sleep tonight, consider how these complex personalities have evolved over more than 20 years of television. Some have grown into beloved icons of animated comedy, while others have become cautionary tales about the importance of character development and consistency. The residents of Quahog continue to entertain, frustrate, and surprise audiences with their unpredictable antics. Whether you love them or hate them, these characters have become integral parts of popular culture, inspiring countless discussions, debates, and analyses like this one. Sweet dreams, and may your subconscious sort through the chaos of Family Guy's character landscape as peacefully as possible. Tomorrow brings new episodes, new controversies, and new opportunities to debate the merits and flaws of Seth MacFarlane's animated creation.